welcome the publication of the final report of the Tribunal of Inquiry into payments to politicians and related matters, and I accept fully the conclusions of the Moriarty Tribunal. And I note from the Taoiseach's address that sentence is missing, and I think the Taoiseach needs to clarify before this debate is over that he accepts the conclusions and findings of the Moriarty report and not just the recommendations. Mr. Justice Moriarty, as we know, had an extremely difficult task. He investigated complex matters and faced active hostility from some individuals before the tribunal. He has done his work with integrity, commitment and skill, and he has produced a very comprehensive report. I believe that the Dáil and the public should thank him for his efforts. This is a report of real significance. Justice Moriarty clearly sets out illicit, inappropriate and irregular behaviour which has done great damage and may perhaps cause much more. This report exposes serious malpractice and corruption. It is not based on the unfounded opinions of one judge. It is based on the evidence. The report addresses two major issues relating to Deputy Micheál Lowry. In relation to improper support he received from Ben Dunne, the evidence of his attempts to seek to corrupt an independent process in favour of Mr Dunne is absolutely clear. However, the public policy implications of this and the unanswered questions are somewhat limited. The main issue of focus in the report is, as a result, the awarding of the second GSM licence. This was the largest commercial contract ever awarded by the Irish state, and the report makes it abundantly clear that the integrity of this process was disgracefully compromised. The state may yet be exposed to punitive compensation claims from losing consortiums, some of whom appeared before the Supreme Court last week. This report is, of course, a deep indictment of the conduct of Deputy Lowry, both as a minister and in the years following his reluctant resignation. In spite of the deeply cynical spinning by government representatives, this report encompasses far more than the damage caused by one rogue politician. The facts are that the licence competition was allowed to develop in a way that directly went against the rules agreed by the then government. It included the targeting of Fine Gael by a consortium through a conspicuous campaign of financial support, and basic procedures were set aside in signing off the award in favour of that consortium. When legitimate questions were raised by another bidder, they were dismissed out of hand by the then Taoiseach and leader of Fine Gael. During all of this, 6 members of the current government were sitting at the cabinet table. Another member of the current cabinet, Minister Hogan, was chairman of the Fine Gael parliamentary party and was directly involved in receiving donations covered by the tribunal's report. The report is a direct challenge to every member of this House to treat its findings with the seriousness they deserve. It contains a lot of detail, but this cannot be allowed to be an excuse for failing to accept clear conclusions. Over the last week, the report and Justice Moriarty have been subject to a sustained attempt to undermine them. This has had two separate but equally serious elements. Firstly, there has been the direct assault of Denis O'Brien, Micheál Lowry and others. One of Ireland's richest men and the owner of substantial media interests has announced his intention to campaign against Justice Moriarty and his belief that there is a conspiracy against him and Deputy Micheál Lowry which has been aided by the entire judicial system. Deputy Lowry's attacks have been equally fierce. Secondly, there is a sustained effort to undermine the impact of the report through attempting to misrepresent its findings as being purely about one rogue minister. The government benches are full of people who have built their careers on posturing about real and imagined ethical issues. When confronted with a report as serious as this, their response has been a combination of silence, misrepresentation and minimisation. In this House, the handling of the report by the government has been cynical in the extreme. Outside of this House, it has been a disgrace. There are 112 government deputies, but vast swathes of the airwaves have been left without a Fine Gael or Labour representative during the last week. It took 4 days before any member of government could be found to criticise the escalating attacks on the judiciary, and not one member of government who participated in the process of awarding the licence has been willing to address their own role or knowledge other than to claim exoneration. The Taoiseach came into this House last week and said that he and the 6 ministers would answer questions, and this pledge was then abandoned before word reached us this morning that the Taoiseach would in fact answer some questions. Although I must say what we heard from the Taoiseach on the order of business was unprecedented. I've never heard of a Taoiseach coming in here saying I'll answer one part of a report and not another part of a report. It's an extraordinary state of affairs. You should be capable of answering all aspects and conclusions of the report in relation to the government decision of which you were a member. I welcome, however, the U-turn that you've made in that regard, and would ask that from now on the prevarication stop and arrangements be made for all of the ministers involved to be questioned on the issue of the awarding of the licence itself. While saying that he had not read the report and could not comment, the Taoiseach claimed here that the report exonerates party leaders and members of the Cabinet, and he repeated that just now in his speech. Having praised his own commitment to transparency and honesty and everything only a few weeks ago, he has repeatedly refused to even acknowledge what the report says about the fundraising activities which he and other Fine Gael ministers participated in. Media management has been the main priority, witnessed again this morning when the media were told about his U-turn and taking questions before the opposition whips. The efforts of Fine Gael spokespeople to claim that the Taoiseach has been forthright and energetic in this response to the report are nonsense. The Taoiseach informed the House that the first report of the Moriarty Tribunal had waited for over a month before it was discussed here. What he failed to state was that it was published a few days before Christmas and there were no opposition calls for an earlier debate. He failed to state that the interim Flood Tribunal and final McCracken Tribunal reports were both debated on the first sitting day following their publication. He also failed to mention the number of times he and other members of government demanded immediate statements and questions on daily evidence before tribunals. Minister Pat Rabbitte is already recorded in history as the deputy most likely to sweep any passing rumour onto the record of this House in his now abandoned quest to rock foundations. Yet he and the Labour Party have been fully complicit in this strategy of minimising the significance of the report. The notion that a Labour Party minister can give clarity or could give clarity on internal Fine Gael affairs was an insult to the public and to the role of this Parliament. The other former ethics hawks who line the government's benches have been studiously non-judgmental and desperate in their attempts to avoid the topic. The only thing they have been loud on is claiming the right to decide who does and does not have the moral standing to even ask questions of Fine Gael and Labour. I would say to deputies who make up the largest majority ever seen in this state, you have the numbers to shout anyone down if you want to. You have the numbers to vote through or block any business. If you want to fill our debates with sycophantic barracking in support of your leaders and against your opponents, you will be able to do this. The challenge for you, however, is whether you will show yourselves to be capable of putting aside the self-righteousness we saw during the election campaign and adhere to the standards we discussed on the first day of the Dáil term. We will see a lot from how you behave in this debate and how you react to legitimate questions, no matter how uncomfortable they are for you. In relation to the judiciary, I would like to repeat my words of last week that I abhor the conspiracy theories and attacks which have been directed at the Irish judicial system in the last week. They are not perfect, but they are a bulwark of our democratic system, and we should not stand back and see them attacked in this manner. I feel we should also acknowledge the work of journalists who have taken considerable professional risks in pursuing some of the matters addressed in this report. In one case, a journalist has been subject to what can only be described as a legal vendetta, which he has had to face down at potentially great financial cost. Politicians often complain about the standards in journalism, but we should be willing to acknowledge major public service when it occurs. When the government of Fine Gael, Labour and the Taoiseach and Minister Rabbitte's Democratic Left was formed, one of the early items on its agenda was a consideration of how the second GSM licence was to be awarded. On March 2, 1995, a memorandum went to Cabinet which set out the process and also guidelines for how ministers should behave during the competition. It was due to be a sealed process which would be entirely non-political from start to end. The role of ministers was to be guardians of the process, reserving for themselves the final decision on the licence as a protection for the integrity of the competition. The guidelines, which were directed at all ministers and not just Deputy Lowry, said that any meetings with bidders should have at least 2 extra witnesses present, that these should be recorded immediately and that social exchanges with bidders should be avoided. Cabinet agreed that this was essential to ensure the transparency and objectivity of the competition. It is in the major deviations from the content and spirit of the process agreed on March 2, 1995 that the most serious issues arise, both for Deputy Micheál Lowry and ministers of the then government. The uncontested facts of the Tribunal's report show that a minister who was supposed to know nothing about the competition sought and received information from officials. They show that he pushed the process in the direction of one of the bidders. They show that he sought to influence at very least the then Taoiseach with a false claim concerning supposed Fianna Fáil links to another bidder. They show that a targeted programme of financial donations to Fine Gael and engagement with Fine Gael politicians were a core part of the strategy of the same bidder. They show that enough was known about this, that Cabinet should have insisted on a detailed report on the process before a decision was made. No twisting by Deputy Lowry, any minister or anyone else can get away from these facts. On the 3rd of December 1996, following on from the announcement that Dunn Stores had paid for work on the Minister for Transport and Communications home, which had not been declared to the revenue, the current Taoiseach Deputy Kenny said, "I very much regret the departure of Deputy Micheál Lowry from Cabinet. I have known him for many years, both as a member of Fine Gael and as a government colleague, and he is a man of the highest integrity and honour." And that perhaps explains the curiously equivocal and almost neutral stance you adopted in your speech earlier in relation to the said deputy. That assessment of yours then, and the assessment in this report of Deputy Lowry, of course, is far less complimentary. It amounts to a shocking indictment of his behaviour. Commenting on his motives or actions, the report says of Deputy Lowry that it is beyond doubt, and I quote, that he gave substantive information to Denis O'Brien of significant value and assistance to him in securing the licence, that he had irregular interactions with interested parties at its most sensitive stages, sought and received substantive information on emerging trends, and made his preferences between the leading candidates known, that he conferred a benefit on Mr Denis O'Brien, a person who made payments to Mr Lowry, that he, quote, that only influenced but delivered the result when HEAnet secured the mobile phone licence, that he was an insidious and pervasive influence on the licensing process, that he had engaged in a cynical and venal abuse of office, and that he was involved in attempting to influence an arrangement that was profoundly corrupt to a degree that was nothing short of breathtaking. Deputy Lowry wants us to put aside the report and believe instead a series of explanations that in fact explain nothing. It is not credible to ask us to see his pattern of actions during the competition and accept that he met with Mr Denis O'Brien at the most sensitive time without either of them mentioning the competition. It is not credible to ask us to ignore the $147,000 paid into an Isle of Man account for his benefit, but returned on the day that the McCracken Tribunal was established. It is not credible to expect us to ignore the English property deals and falsified documentation. It is not credible at the end of this tribunal to expect us to accept his blanket denials over the accumulated evidence. As I have said, the guidelines adopted by Cabinet on March 2, 1995 laid great stress on the need to avoid contact with the bidders. Not only was this not adhered to, there was in fact what the report calls a concerted campaign of conspicuous financial support of Fine Gael during the competition period and immediately afterwards. Paragraph 4134 of the report points out that excluding the $50,000 Telenor cheque, a total of £22,140 was paid by Mr O'Brien or HEAnet companies to Fine Gael between January 1995 and June 1996. The evidence before the tribunal was that HEAnet had relatively limited financial resources available to it during most of this time, yet chose to prioritise donations to Fine Gael. The evidence before the tribunal was also that not one person in Fine Gael raised a concern during that time. Not one. That this is all the more striking given the fact that a substantial sum of these donations was made in a manner where they were known to senior members but designed to avoid public scrutiny. The report contains a short but extraordinary letter written on HEAnet notepaper by Ms Sarah Carey to Deputy Phil Hogan 2 weeks before the licence was awarded. It states, and I quote, "Dear Phil, please find enclosed a draft for the golf on the 16th. I understand Denis has requested that there are no references made to his contribution at the event. Best of luck on the day. I'll give you a call soon, Sarah Carey." Unquote. Enclosed was £4,000 sponsorship for the Fine Gael National Golf Classic. This donation was made by way of a bank draft by HEAnet at a time which, in Justice Moriarty's words, coincided with a critical point in the evaluation process of the mobile phone licence. Minister Hogan was at that time chairman of the Fine Gael Parliamentary Party, director of elections for by-elections and centrally involved in fundraising. Today he is a cabinet minister, trusted lieutenant to the Taoiseach, national director of elections for Fine Gael and centrally involved in the party's fundraising. While she is a minor figure in the whole affair, Ms Carey's approach to the tribunal has been illustrative of a much wider strategy followed by others. When caught out, her approach has been to minimise the issue and look for distractions. Her light untruths to the tribunal related to when she leaked material in a vain attempt to spread Fine Gael's pain to others. The idea that a donation to an opposition party in the years after the competition should distract from what went on within Fine Gael at that time is remarkable. As well as ESAT conspicuously supporting Fine Gael fundraiser, Mr O'Brien and his company is engaged in what Justice Moriarty describes as a concerted campaign to raise its profile with Fine Gael with the assistance of Mr Dan Egan, a former Fine Gael advisor. In 2003 at the Tribunal, Mr Egan confirmed that in this period he had arranged a meeting for Mr O'Brien with the then Minister for Tourism and Trade, Deputy Enda Kenny. This meeting took place on the 17th of May 1995. I believe it appropriate for the Taoiseach to outline to the House his knowledge of the concerted campaign undertaken by Mr O'Brien in regard to Fine Gael ministers.